many historical events end up being forgotten or ignored over the years. In some cases, this forgetfulness is not merely a consequence of time, but also of political influence and specific gaps in national and ethnic perception. Today's video addresses one of these less discussed topics. Some of our recent videos, which covered Romania's role in the Holocaust, the Nanjing Massacre, and other aspects of the Holocaust, began with explicit content warnings. This episode of A Day to Never Forget follows the same approach, and may even require a stronger warning about what you are about to see. This video tells the story of a largely forgotten place in China, where people were subjected to brutal treatment, often worse than laboratory animals, by other human beings. We urge you to watch with caution. This content is intended for adults or older teenagers under the supervision of a guardian. After our video on the Nanjing event, some viewers, without any evidence, accused us of spreading Chinese communist propaganda. First of all, everything we report is true. These events actually happened. We encourage you to research for yourself and verify the facts. Second, the writer of this and other scripts lived in Japan for a period and worked there as a teacher. He has always held respect and admiration for modern Japan and its people. 21st century Japan resembles 1940s Japan as much as modern Germany resembles the Nazi regime. In other words, not at all. However, the Japanese of World War II committed horrific crimes. History has shown us that atrocities of this magnitude have occurred in almost every civilization over time. Such crimes are most common when encouraged or ordered by a country's leadership. One of history's darkest lessons is that, when given permission to act without consequences, many people are capable of becoming true executioners. Japan has a unique history. From the early 17th century to the mid-19th century, the country remained isolated from the rest of the world under orders from the shoguns, who ruled in the emperor's name. Foreigners were allowed only on a small island near Nagasaki, and no Japanese citizen was permitted to leave the country under any circumstances. This scenario changed drastically between 1853 and 1854, when U.S. naval officer Matthew C. Perry forcibly opened Japan to international trade. When the sailors and Marines in Perry's fleet landed in Japan, they were stunned by what they saw. The country seemed to have been frozen in time since the 1600s. Its buildings, clothing, and especially its weaponry were centuries behind those of the United States and the Western world. Meanwhile, China was increasingly falling under foreign control. Some regions were virtually governed by European powers, and the Chinese government was forced to sign a series of agreements known as the unequal treaties. These treaties favored foreign interests, allowing them to make enormous profits, while much of the Chinese population suffered. Furthermore, in areas of China under European influence or control, foreign citizens and soldiers were subject only to their own laws, completely disregarding local regulations. This even extended to crimes committed against Chinese people, which went unpunished. In response to this reality, the Japanese were determined to prevent the same from happening to their own country. To achieve this, they adopted a strategy of playing one foreign power against another, sometimes even threatening violent uprisings against Westerners who came to trade in Japan. At the same time, they understood the limits of their own power and made concessions when necessary. Thus, they established two major goals: to modernize Japan as quickly as possible and to prevent Western nations from exploiting Japan as they were doing with China. After a period of internal conflict, Emperor Meiji assumed full control of the nation, and the shogunate came to an end. Between 1871 and 1905, Japan underwent a radical transformation, shifting from a society based on 17th century traditions to a modern industrial power with an advanced military. To the world's surprise, but not to the Japanese themselves, Japan won two significant wars, one against China in 1896 and another against the Russian Empire in 1905. Russia's defeat shocked the international community, and Japan sought recognition as an equal among Western powers. However, there is a fundamental difference in how Japan and the West viewed the world. Much of this divergence was linked to race and culture. For a long time, Western nations led the world in military strength, technology, and economic power, and they were reluctant to accept Japan as their equal. Racial prejudice played a significant role in this resistance, but there was also the perception that Japan had only advanced due to European influence. On the other hand, the Japanese saw their country as one that had risen from an underdeveloped agricultural society into an emerging power. This perspective fueled their pursuit of international recognition and respect. The industrial strength of Japan managed to surpass two much larger nations in military conflicts. For centuries, China viewed Japan as a subordinate nation, while the Russians believed that their navy, army, and soldiers, considered more modern, would easily defeat the Japanese. However, they were unaware that the Japanese armed forces were actually more advanced than their own, with better trained troops and more skilled commanders. The victory over Russia was a significant source of pride for the Japanese, as it demonstrated to the world that Japan could compete on equal terms with any Western power. However, many Japanese felt they had been treated unfairly by Western countries in the agreements that concluded these wars. The territorial concessions and trade agreements established after Russia's defeat did not meet the expectations of the Japanese population. They believed that their victory deserved more substantial rewards. During World War I, Japan allied with the Allied powers and helped keep the German Navy confined to the Pacific and China. Despite its relatively minor involvement, Japan gained control of some former German colonies in the region. However, for many Japanese, this still seemed insufficient. In response to this situation, two groups were blamed for the perceived lack of respect toward Japan: the civilian government and Western powers. Many Japanese believed that Europeans, especially, were deliberately trying to prevent Japan's growth. To some extent, this suspicion was justified. A strong and nearby Japan could threaten British, Dutch, and French colonies, as well as American business interests in Asia. Furthermore, the increasing Western influence in Japanese cities caused dissatisfaction, particularly among conservative military officials. Western fashion began to gain popularity, especially among women, who started demanding more rights and job opportunities outside the home. Baseball and jazz music became popular pastimes in Japan, and baseball remains one of the country's most beloved sports to this day. But why are we explaining all this in a video about Japanese atrocities in World War II China? Because it is impossible to understand these events without first understanding the factors that led to them. In the early 1930s, Japan became a military dictatorship. Throughout the 1930s and the first half of the 1940s, the country transformed into a fascist state, posing a danger not only to its own citizens, but also to its neighbors. The Japanese military government promoted, through the media, education, mass rallies, and its own actions, ideas such as the supposed ethnic superiority of the Japanese, unconditional obedience to the emperor, and a new interpretation of the samurai code. Among the principles promoted was extreme loyalty to the point of death and contempt for anything non-Japanese. This code of conduct, known as Bushido, bore little resemblance to the true ways of the ancient samurai and was more of a nationalist indoctrination tool. The group that suffered the most from this mindset was the Chinese people. For centuries, the Chinese had demanded and received tributes from Japan in various forms. As a result, Chinese culture had a strong influence on Japan, and although Japanese culture developed unique characteristics over time, its writing system, religion, and other cultural elements had Chinese roots. By the 20th century, many Japanese saw themselves as a people who had surpassed their former status as subordinates and had become superior even to China itself. These beliefs, combined with nationalist ideology, led the Japanese to act in China in a manner similar to the Nazis in occupied Europe, with a sense of superiority and total disregard for non-Japanese lives. In 1931, Japan occupied Manchuria, a Chinese territory. In 1936, it launched a full-scale invasion of China, quickly taking control of much of the eastern region, particularly coastal cities. The Chinese who fell under Japanese occupation were subjected to cruel and inhumane treatment. Horrific atrocities followed one another, the most infamous being the Nanjing Massacre in 1937. Beyond extreme violence, The Japanese also exploited the Chinese population economically under their rule. China became a massive human laboratory, where civilians were not only exposed to the brutalities of modern warfare, but were also subjected to scientific experiments conducted by the Japanese military to test chemical and biological weapons. The conflict cost China millions of lives, both military and civilian. Estimates of Chinese deaths between 1936 and 1945 range from 10 to 20 million people. One of the key figures responsible for increasing this number was Shiro Ishii, a man whose name became synonymous with cruelty. Like Joseph Mengele in Auschwitz, Ishii was a doctor. Born in 1892 into a middle-class family, he graduated in medicine in 1921 and joined the army as a surgeon. He had an obsessive interest in studying infections and, after visiting the battlefields of World War I in Europe, became deeply interested in the possibilities of chemical and biological weapons. After spending 2 years researching the effects of these weapons on battlefields and speaking with doctors and officers who had fought in the war, Ishii gained recognition as an expert in the development of weapons of mass destruction. In 1936, he was ordered to create a new special unit. The unit was officially named Water Purification Unit No. 731, but became widely known simply as Unit 731, both at the time and in the present day. Ishii worked alongside several other doctors, including his right-hand man, Dr. Hisato Yoshimura. In addition to them, there were other medical professionals on the team, along with an entire company of guards and assistants. Unit 731's headquarters were located in an old fortress that also served as a prisoner camp near the city of Harbin in northern China. The facility could hold up to 1,000 prisoners at a time. Throughout its operation, from its creation until the end of the war, Unit 731 was responsible for the deaths of somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people. To better understand the challenges in estimating the exact number of Chinese victims during the conflict, we suggest watching our video about the Nanjing Massacre. Most of the prisoners who perished under Unit 731's experiments were not executed using conventional methods, such as firing squads or hanging. Nor were they killed in gas chambers, as the Nazis did to their victims in the extermination camps in Poland. Instead, the vast majority lost their lives due to the experiments conducted by Ishii, Yoshimura, and their team. These lethal tests took on various forms. Thousands of Chinese civilians in surrounding areas were exterminated when Unit 731 deliberately released various pathogens among the unsuspecting population. The diseases unleashed included bubonic plague, typhus, and smallpox. Additionally, prisoners were injected with tuberculosis, cholera, syphilis, and gonorrhea, as well as deliberately infected with dysentery. Bombs filled with plague-infected fleas were dropped on entire communities. Children were fed food contaminated with highly toxic chemical compounds, and their bodies were later dissected and studied. Some were subjected to excessive doses of tetanus vaccines, causing uncontrollable muscle spasms that often resulted in death. Inside the facility, doctors and soldiers wore protective gear to avoid contamination. Outside, figures dressed in biosafety suits, resembling otherworldly apparitions, roamed the field, observing the devastating effects of biological weapons on people who suffered in agony until they died. The purpose of these missions was not to provide aid, but to assess the lethality, duration, and effectiveness of the infectious agents created in the unit's laboratories. Other experiments involved exposure to extreme levels of radiation through X-rays, causing severe internal and external burns. These injuries were meticulously studied after the victims succumbed to the exposure. Prisoners were also dissected while still alive, without anesthesia, so that Ishii and his team could closely monitor the progression of infections before the bodies began to decompose. While some of these experiments were justified as scientific investigations, many appeared to have been conducted purely out of sadistic cruelty. Some victims were burned alive with flamethrowers. Others were exposed to chemical weapons, having toxic substances poured directly onto their naked bodies or forced into their mouths and other orifices. Incarcerated women were subjected to sexual violence, in some cases forced to have intercourse with other prisoners under the pretext of studying whether conception was possible even when the individuals were infected with fatal diseases such as syphilis and gonorrhea. Many guards also became infected after raping the prisoners, despite the practice being officially prohibited. Following methods used by Nazi doctors, Ishii and his subordinates subjected prisoners to extreme conditions, including exposure to freezing temperatures and experiments in low-pressure chambers. They also induced heart attacks, performed forced abortions on prisoners and women from nearby communities, and carried out surgical procedures that seemed straight out of a horror film. Arms were amputated and replaced with legs, genitals were removed, and countless other atrocities were committed. The list of horrors appears endless, including acts of cruelty even more brutal than those already mentioned. When World War II ended in September 1945, Ishii was in Japan. He was captured by U.S. forces, along with several members of his team. However, just as happened with many sought-after Nazi war criminals, Ishii was granted immunity from prosecution. That's right, he was protected by the U.S. military government. The reason? American authorities believed that the data collected by Ishii and his team during the war could be useful for the U.S. in future conflicts. Ishii lived peacefully until his death in 1959. Meanwhile, several officers and scientists from Unit 731 were captured by the Soviets when the Red Army invaded northern China in the final days of the war. Surprisingly, they were not executed, despite some receiving prison sentences of 20 years or more. In the 1950s, many of these prisoners were sent back to Japan as part of a Soviet initiative to improve diplomatic relations with the country. After the war, former members of Unit 731 even held public reunions in Japan without facing any punishment for their crimes. This is not an easy video to watch, but if you found the content relevant, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell to receive updates on our upcoming releases.